what value unites Americans more than any other? The answer is kind of ironic. We're united by autonomy. People across race, gender, and political ideology want to control themselves and how they show up in their world. That's just one takeaway from the 10th anniversary of Ipsos Global Trends, our largest public research report ever. Hi, welcome to Insights to Activate, Ipsos' series focusing on some of the biggest topics facing the world today. I'm Ben Meyerson, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Ipsos, and I'll be your host as we talk about global trends. We interviewed more than 50,000 people in 50 markets around the world, representing 3/4 of the world's population and 90% of the world's GDP, to bring you insights you won't get anywhere else. The takeaways may be global in scope, but they're especially crucial for businesses operating here in the US, whether or not you operate on an international scale. We have a fantastic group of experts today, from MasterCard, Publicis, and Ipsos, who will talk about how trends and foresight can help your business break through. But first, let's take a moment to talk about the global trends themselves and how businesses in the US should act on them. It's a trends report like no other because it's based on 10 years of data, millions of data points, in fact, and input from our global teams doing macro and signals analysis. And the trends? They're designed to be applicable and actionable. For example, it all boils down to these 9 trends that are actionable today. Globalization fractures, splintered societies, climate convergence, techno-wonder, conscientious health, a retreat to old systems, nouveau nihilism, the power of trust, and the escape to individualism. We dive into all these in our full report, which I hope you'll read on ipsosglobaltrends.com. But here are some quick takeaways for businesses in the US. As you think about all this, remember that over the past 10 years, we've seen a massive increase in the number of people in the US and around the world who say they prefer to buy from brands that align with their values. In the US, that's up a whopping 20 percentage points, from 50% to 70%. So, how can brands get past concerns over globalization? Well, you can play up local strengths to tie into the Made in the USA or Shop Local movements. What about our splintering society? You can commit to America's many shared values to help lower temperatures in the polarized US. We talked about the climate in our last Insights to Activate around ESG, and your brand can connect with consumers by demonstrating that you're taking action, but also you can help people feel that they are contributing. Techno-wonder is everywhere. Take advantage of this by identifying the benefits of new tech like AI while reducing concerns people have around privacy, misuse, and job loss. Conscientious health is a major issue in the US, and stakeholders can help Americans in our complex health system with clear, trusted information and accessible solutions. The retreat to old systems. We all have nostalgia, but brands need to also recognize that not everyone wants to return to America's past. Nouveau nihilism is huge as well. Many younger Americans have a big gap between their aspirations and their realities, but there's space for brands to help bridge that gap. The power of trust is especially huge for brands to be aware of. Align your shared values with your audiences to build strong relationships in a polarized world. And individualism, so important in America. Leverage those trusted relationships to help people express their identities as they choose. Big picture trends. How do you make use of them? And what do you need to know to make trends work into your business to connect with potential customers? Let's talk to our panel and get into it.
Great. I'm Jana Delancey, and I head up Global Foresight, Insights, and Analytics at MasterCard.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angel Bayon. I'm head of culture intelligence at the Community, a Publicis Group agency.
Fantastic to meet you. My name's Oscar Yuan. I lead Strategy 3 here at Ipsos, which is the team that does this global trend survey.
Great. So glad to have you all here today. Let's start with you, Oscar. As you mentioned, the team that put this report together across the world, looking at so many different factors. Can you take us through a little bit what this means for brands here in the US? Obviously, it's a global survey, but a lot of companies may be wondering, what is it here for us in the US? What do we need to know?
I think the interesting thing about the US is obviously our size and the velocity at which trends happen here in the US, and you probably see this in your day-to-day work. So I think for the US, it's really a matter of really paying attention to this. I would say even more so than some of the other countries around the world. I think we shouldn't forget that we often are the vanguard of these things that happen very, very quickly, and the rest of the world is actually looking to us to actually think about how does this impact our brands, how does this impact our businesses. The second thing I think is really important is that we have to remember the US is also a bit more divided in the way we think about things. That the Trends survey revealed, right? So you're thinking about things like splintered societies, you think about income inequality. I think those are all things that we tend to forget. And we've kind of been navigating the middle of the road here. And I think it's a really tight rope for our brands to have to walk here in the US and navigate, which is why I think this type of data is really, really important.
And how do they, so what should they know as they take these and try to make them work, put them in action every day?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing to know is just both sides of the story, right? I think we often forget, you're a brand that does this, or you're a brand that does this. And I think being able to navigate that middle space, you can only navigate that middle space if you understand the two extremes quite well. And I think that's going to be really critical for us as we think about going forward into this big election year, but also beyond that, right?
Angel, you have such a great perspective coming into all this. As the head of cultural intelligence, how do trends and foresight inform the way that you talk to people inside Publicis Group and outside?
Yeah, so I can only talk about the clients and accounts that I work on. But what I try to do when it comes to trends and foresight is really make sure that we're operationalizing and talking from the same language. Well, how are we defining trends? How are we defining foresight? And then having clear KPIs and objectives of how we're using both. Is it about brand strategy? Is it about creative strategy? Is it about purpose strategy? Because all of that needs to be taken into account on how we're going to apply the research, how we're going to apply the output, how we're going to tell the stories, and who are the stakeholders in the audience of what we're delivering as well.
I love what you said about being clear on the definitions, because I think trends and foresight is traditionally seen as this mushy thing that I don't know what the future is going to look like, so we're just making some guesses. And I think really clearly defining how we use it and where we use it is really critical. If you think about companies and their strategic planning process, there's always a module on finance, and there's a module on marketing, and there's a module on customer. There's very rarely a module on what's going to happen in the future. And yet, I think that's getting increasingly important. And so I think it's up to us, people like us and organizations like ours, think about, okay, what does trends and foresight mean? How do we use it? And what does it inform? And how does it inform things like innovation, marketing strategy, customer segmentation? I think it's becoming an increasingly important part of the conversation that we're trying to define how we get there.
And one of the most critical things, and you were alluding to it, is really making sure it's actionable, right? It's great to have these great foresights, the world's gonna collapse in 30 years. No, I'm kidding. It's not, just to be clear. But if you don't make it actionable, then it's not useful. And for foresights, that's particularly hard because we're talking future. So I think of it as laddering steps to get to this future picture. So what are those different scenarios that you have to look at to get to that particular future?
Yeah. And I think even with foresight, right, people often conflate foresight to think about how are we going to live, how are we going to shop in like 2040, 2050. Yeah. But if we think about foresight in its definition, for is in front, looking in front. Yeah. So a lot of what I do is teaching the agency account people, the clients, how to look and what's in front of you, because everything that is there that's about to happen is really in front of us. The signals are there, the data are there. And it's not about the 2040s and 2050s, which is, yes, those are the projects that we can sink our teeth into. But we can also use foresight to think about what happens in the US after November. We could think about what happens in a world where Ozempic and Mounjaro become mainstream, not just for food and beverage clients, but beauty, health and wellness, retail, fashion, right? So you can even try to even farther and think about what is the connection for MasterCard, right? Like there's an implication for financial services.
But I think we're also scared of it sometimes because it's imprecise, right? And I think sometimes when you talk to business leaders, well, I don't know if that's going to happen. You're like, well, neither do I, but I'd rather be prepared in case that does happen. I say all the time, I'd rather be directionally correct than precisely wrong, right? And I sometimes think we fool ourselves into thinking that precision is the holy grail, When in some respects it is, but in other respects, things like foresight and trends, it's like, well, let's think about where we need to head, so we're ready for that when it happens, so we're not caught flat-footed.
Yeah, no one could predict the future.
Yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here, right? We'd be billionaires if we could. But it's not about predicting the future. It's about predicting potential outcomes.
Yes.
Right? So that way we can advise our clients or our organization on how to maintain organizational resiliency. So they can have the plan Bs, the plan Cs, the plan Ds for the what ifs that could potentially happen in the future.
And when you talk about cultural intelligence, right, that's a lot of what you talk about in your role. I mean, so to what extent does a giant foresight report like this, how does that factor into the way that you go through that day to day?
Yeah. So looking at this report, I immediately thought like, wow, this is the Cliff's Notes of global culture. But that's kind of like an outdated term. So I was like, this is the ChatGPT of future global culture. Like 80% of the work is done, but the actionable, right? That's the secret sauce. That's the human level that we need to bring to the work to make sure that we are representing our audiences, right? That we are thinking about what our brand could be and what it should be. Making sure that everything from end-to-end diffusion, from research and insights all the way to the output is future correct and culture forward. And trends and foresight are tools as a culture intelligence expert, important tools in my toolkit, right? Because it allows you to map the culture, it allows you to forecast the future, and it allows you to unearth opportunities that are critical to building businesses. When we think about strategy is critical to sustaining a business. But there's a lot of blind spots if we're just looking through strategy that trends and foresight allows us to bring in and have a more comprehensive view.
Yeah. I think the other difference is it requires a little bit of work on the recipient's part, right? Which we often forget. You're like, oh, here's trends and foresight report. They're like, okay, this is great. How do I use this? And my nudge is always, it requires a little bit of effort on your part to say, what does it mean for your company? What does it mean for a technology company like MasterCard, right? It's not, here's the roadmap for what needs to happen, but it requires a little bit of imagination that goes beyond that to say, okay, so what are the possibilities? What are the scenarios that are going to emerge from this? And how do we get there? I think that is actually the fun part that many organizations skip, right? They see the report and they're like, okay, great, now what? Yeah. And I think it's up to us to kind of be the advocates for that kind of work.
Yeah, and that's what I really respect about the report, because so many conversations that I have, people think it's a lot of art and less science. And this report really shows, and thank you, you're bringing gravitas to what we all do and giving respect, right? And authority to what we do, because it's a lot of science and some art, right? That's the creative part. That's the application, envisioning what could potentially be, right? Because it's coming out of all this data. It's not coming from a crystal ball, with oftentimes people think, is what we do.
Yeah. Jenna, I'll start with you now. Like, I think this segues really well into the question I had for you, which is about the global versus the local, right? I mean, you're based here in the U.S., but you have a global role with MasterCard as a global tech company. But as the head of foresight, how important do you think it is to look at things from one perspective versus the other? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly, and I might disagree with one of the things you said earlier, just a little. So yes, many trends have started here in the U.S., but quite honestly, many are starting outside the U.S. They're starting in Asia Pacific. They're starting in Latin America, and they're coming to us because we've become a little bit lax. I think the other thing is, for our company and for every company, our customers are around the world, and each and every one of them are really, really important to us. I care as much about the people in Nigeria as I do about the people in the United States. Yes, at the moment, the United States may make up a big portion of business, but at the same time, at MasterCard, we are really careful. Inclusion is important. One of our quotes from our CEO is something to the effect of, if it's not inclusive, it's not important. If it can't scale, and therefore it's not important. So for us, inclusivity is important. So for me, I really have to look across the globe and say, what is important in each of these places? There are differences, there are similarities, and it's important to point out both, because those differences are the things that could attract somewhere else in the near future. And so that's why it's critically important. And the other thing is, human beings want to be reflected. We want to see ourselves in things. And so if I do my foresight work or even my insights work without really bringing to life all of the populations of the world, I've failed. I have failed if I haven't done that. And MasterCard really looks to me and my team to really bring those voices to life. We talk about being the voice of the consumer and the customer in the building. And to do that, I've got to be everybody's voice, not just echo chamber of the US. I've got to be everybody's voice. And I think that's really important. And I agree with you, there's a lot that has started here, but I think it's so important to have all of the voices around the world.
I might even go so far to say that I think those differences, and we're seeing this in the trend survey, might become even more pronounced going forward. One of the big things we're seeing is this idea of starting to question globalization, right? And it's done enormous things for us as a globe, but we're starting to see numbers tick up where people are questioning whether globalization is good for their country, right? And what that means is we could see a little bit of a retreat from the systems we've known, the post-World War II kind of coming together. Maybe we're moving into a next era, but I think there's going to be some interesting things that happen in the next decades around how people view their place in the world. And I think for brands like ours, figuring out how we facilitate that, or how do we encourage that, or how do we celebrate differences will be really important going forward.
It comes back all the time to inclusivity. Yeah. Are we being inclusive? Yes. In our products, in our services, in our values, in the way we speak externally? It's all got to be consistent. And if we say we're inclusive, then we have to be inclusive. And that means meeting people where they are. They're not looking to come to us, they're looking for us to meet them where they are. And I think as you do foresight work, you think about what could happen, and you think about that from different, so I build up to a global view versus global view down. It's really important to build up to a global view. So seeing each of the places, am I answering your question sufficiently?
No, I'm interested. Go on. Say more.
Seeing all the places and seeing what's happening individually, and then bringing that together with the similarities and pointing out the differences so that we're being appropriate where we land. We want everybody to have an amazing experience when they interact with their circles, wherever that is, in whatever way it is. We want an amazing experience, and to do that, we've got to know them.
Can you talk a little bit more about building up, like an example where you've done that, where you've started somewhere, and what kind of insights did you get from each individual block that helped you scale?
Yeah, so for us, it's really looking about the result, building enough. I do a brand study that is done in over 47 countries. And so we look at the individual countries and we look at what's happening globally. We look at the individual countries and kind of roll it together. This is why this is happening. This is why this is shading this. This global number is covering this. So you're not seeing that this is happening because it didn't roll up high enough. So it's really important to pull out the nuances. And when we think about the future, everybody's starting in a different place around the world. Countries are not in the same place. So if you're doing foresight work, you have to say, okay, we think the trend is this, but where are they starting from? And if they're starting from here or here, you have to know how to build to that trend from there. And this country over here may be starting from here, well, the trend's here. So it's important to look at each of those. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I'm going to jump off this with Angel here.
I just wanted to touch on that because we're primarily talking about the future because of foresight, but that's where history also is super valuable, because you can track how emerging markets are going to perceive globalization at a certain time period based on more developed economies like the US, like the UK as well.
Yeah. I think we often forget the importance of history, right? And I going to even build on what you said, Janet. I think this requires a different skill set than people traditionally, right? What you're saying is it requires a little bit of an integrative view of like, how do I take these pieces together, and then how do I craft a story that holds it all in one place? Whereas I think marketing and business before was somewhat directive, right? You would come up from here, here's what we're going to do, we're going to execute this strategy everywhere, bum, 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 this is how it happens. I think it's going to be requiring a little bit of a shift in the skills and how we approach it, right? I love what you said about integrative, tying it all together and then building up.
And when you think about it, Gen Z's different. They're not going to look exactly like, they don't look exactly like us. Okay, me. They don't look like me. Maybe these people are Gen Zs. I'm not going to quote on that. I'm not going to quote on that, but it's not me. I can just verify it's not me. So, but they're different, and we can't expect them to be the same. So it's the same approach, and when you think about how they're going to behave with some of this stuff, they aren't hitting the same milestones. And that was even in the trends report, right? They're not hitting the same milestones in the same way. And they're attacking them differently, and whether they choose them or not is yet to be seen. And so, and when they choose them, we know is not the same. And so it's really thinking about these trends and saying, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean? Where do we go with that? And it's really thinking about it very differently.
Yeah. And that makes me think of a question that I'm going to stew on after this. Is Gen Z as a global community is going to be much more similar than different, right? So do these market nuances actually sustain themselves in the future in 20, 30 years? I don't know. But it's not going to be the market by market nuance that I feel is dominating the conversation right now.
I might challenge you a little bit on that, where I think they will be perhaps similar as a group, but they are going to be very different, I would say, than every generation prior, right? So this is the first survey where I love what you said about milestones. This is the first survey where we're starting to see respondents say, actually, those don't apply to me anymore, right? This is, I've been told I can't buy a house, I can't afford this, I have student loans, so screw it. I'm not going to save any money, and I'm going to go see Taylor Swift in Vienna, which didn't happen. But that's how they're starting to spend money.
89th birthday.
There you go, right? And so I think there has been this year, we're starting to see is a big departure from all previous generations, right? Where we used to think they used to build on each other, you're starting to see in Gen Z a departure from the traditional systems of this is how I want to spend my money and my life and how I want to invest. Some of it, interestingly, even going backwards. We saw, I don't know if you guys are found, there's a huge trending thing on TikTok called the trad wife, right? Which is the idea that I want to live the traditional life of a wife. I want to be a mother. I want to stay home and prepare meals. I want to stay home and take care of the family, which is trending, and it's a huge, interesting thing. It's almost kind of push against all the progressivism that we're starting to see, right? So I think this is for the first time, maybe driven by social media, we're starting to see a departure from generations past in a substantial way.
Yeah. But I think for every trend, there's a counter trend.
Sure.
And we have to be mindful of that. And also there's certain trends that benefit certain people. So we need to be mindful of what we're recommending as well and the outputs that we are delivering.
Yeah, and we talk about that a little bit in the retreat to old systems trend overall, right? So like people are pining for things to be simpler, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone doesn't want to go back to the same past. They may have people have different ideas about those things. So there's certain people that have some ideas and certain people that may have different ideas about it. Going to the Gen Z bit, we have Ipsos research actually that shows that in a lot of ways, Gen Z is more similar globally than many other generations, and that's because largely of social media, right? Yeah. I mean, for the millennial generation, Facebook, it was on the rise, but it really wasn't unifying the global conversation in the way that social media is these days. Like people that are coming up now in Gen Z and beyond have really experienced a global conversation that is real time in a way that previous generations haven't, even if they've been trending that direction.
Right.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Let's throw to some questions from our audience here. I think we have some coming in.
Cool.
This is a good one. Let's just throw this one to Oscar. Give him the tricky one here. So, so Oscar, that's a huge survey. We talked about millions of data points and surveying more than 50,000 people. But how do you possibly get that down to just 9 trends?
Oh no, that's a worse question than I even expected. I think by definition, to get from 5 million data points down to 9, it's going to be reductive. But I think one of the biggest things we do is we look at, as the word suggests, trends, right? So what are the points and what are the questions that we see the most movement on from 10 years ago? And I think we have the benefit of having 10 years of longitudinal data, right? What are the biggest shifts that we're seeing? And those are the things that we're paying attention to. And that gives you the dig sites to really look at, okay, actually, let's scratch here because I think there's something interesting here. So, one of the reasons why that globalization question is important is we've seen enormous shifts in the last 10 years on perceptions around globalization. Same thing on traditionalism, right? Where it used to be a certain way and now people actually believe traditionalism is something else. And so the first thing we do is look at kind of what are the big shifts that we're seeing. And then we double click onto, okay, what are the values that are driving this, and then helps you kind of do some clustering. But it is a big data analytics challenge that is beyond what I'm good at, but it's really telling. To your point, it is very, very data driven. It's not trends in the name of of trends. But it's
Right,
based
and the
on-
beauty is,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The beauty is you've got all the data, so as things start to change, you can go back and reanalyze that data and see if something needs to change, and that's the beauty.
That's right. And the fun part is seeing the change and then linking it to what's happening in the world around you, right? And then you can start to see stories emerge. I think one of the most interesting things that we're seeing this year is this idea of nouveau nihilism, right? Where Gen Z is saying, wait a minute, I don't know what the future is going to hold. I can't be planning for the future. And you're asking me to sign a 30-year mortgage? No. I'm going to take what I can do today, what I can control today, what I can enjoy today, and do that, right? Which is a very different philosophy than perhaps all of us have grown up with around save for the future and plan for later.
Yeah. Let's talk about the building blocks also. Like we talked about building block by block and coming up. How does that kind of philosophy feed into this? We've got analysts all over the world, right? Looking at the data points as it comes in.
No, we have a great team all over the world. You'll see their names in the report, but I think exactly as you said, them feeding us the stories that are happening on the ground helps us weave them into something cohesive, right? Because in the end, data points are just zeros and ones. How do you take the zeros and ones and turn them into something that people will remember? I think is part of the fun of what we get to do.
All right, let's take another question here. All right, so again, let's talk about the directionality of this. How do you take this and do something with it? So let's throw this one to you, Angel. How do you figure out what's relevant to brands looking at a big survey like this?
Yeah. So as head of culture intelligence, what I really try to do and try to train my team to do is it's all about cultural honesty. Cultural relevance to me is cost of entry. Every brand is trying to lean it, and it gets conflated with what's trending on TikTok. That's what we kind of equate to cultural relevancy. So cultural honesty is about uncovering truths. So trends to me are cultural truths. The values that are presented in the report, human truths. Then as someone working on a brand and brand experts, we have to think about through the lens of our brand truths. So intersecting that all together. And then again, the utility, the use case is a creative strategy. You mentioned nouveau nihilism. Taking a trend like nouveau nihilism, thinking about it through the lens of the target consumers that I work with. Yeah. And then also, are there underserved consumers that are not being paid attention? Not just marginalized, but it could be gender, it could be age, it could be generation. How should that be expressed through creative? How should that be expressed through experiential? If we think about business strategy, does it unearth new opportunities and new markets? So again, it's looking at it, thinking about the nuance and putting it through the lens of all of these different truths together, and then identifying the use case and applying it.
I'm just going to do a plug. Nouveau nihilism is my favorite favorite trend in the Global Trend Survey. I think
I love alliteration too.
Alliteration is great, but it's also a huge departure from how people are thinking about, how they manage their lives and their assets and what they choose. There's so many good implications across businesses. That's my plug.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll hit it to you again, Oscar, as well, because obviously you were in charge of activating this with brands, because that's what we do. That's why we're here. Right. So I mean, how are you going through, and how are you picking each individual thing, or what are you emphasizing as you go out and talk to clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is it'll differ by industry, of course, right? So if you're a technology company, I think one of the important things you're thinking about is not just what your technology can do, but its impact on society. And that you're starting to see really, really kind of creep up in the world, right? It's this techno wonder, the wonder of it, but also wonder in the sense of I wonder what this is going to do for us as a society, I think is a really good question. I think nouveau nihilism is such an interesting question for consumer companies that are selling goods that are kind of to be enjoyed, whether that's travel, whether that's ice cream, right? There is this short-termism that's creeping up that I want to do what I can today because I can't control what's going to happen later on, right? So really depends on the industry, but with the 9, I think there's really interesting things for every industry that I've spoken to. So.
And part of that nouveau nihilism started really right after COVID, because everybody was cramped, stuffed, not out, right? And they came out of that saying, my mental health is critical and nobody cares about it but me. I'm never gonna stick like this again, no matter what. And they're looking for those moments of joy, is how we talk about them. They're looking for a moment of joy. In some cases, they're looking for a quick, simple moment of joy, and they'll spend on that. And in other cases, they are looking for that trip for the year, right? So that big thing that they'll do this year. And but it's a real challenge with the economic situation that people are in. So there's a real tension between my joy and optimism that I want, which is feeding that, and the economic situation I'm in. So it's watching them debate that and figure out what they're going to do and when they're going to do it.
Yeah. I think there's also a tie, interesting, with neoliberalism with this idea of trust, right? I think there has been, during COVID, exactly as you said, this lack of trust or this disintegration of trust in many of our systems, right? Like, I don't trust the government to protect me. I don't trust the healthcare to have everyone's back. I don't trust all these things. So the only thing I can rely on is myself now. And it kind of ties into this idea of rise of individualism. A whole bunch of things are going on at the same time that are kind of shaping how people behave.
All right, one more then. Let's talk about, let's throw this one to you, Jenna. So, this one is again about trust. So if it's so important to people around the world, right? So how do you work trust into the way that you run your business?
Yeah, trust is the backbone of what we do, and we're very, very grateful and thrilled to be one of the most trusted brands, which is unusual for a financial brand.
Or a technology brand.
Or a technology brand.
We're both. Technology brand,
we're both.
Yeah.
And we like to put them both together, so it's great. But the reality is, fortunately, MasterCard has a very high trust response. And we treat that very seriously. That is important in every single product that we develop. If it cannot be protected, it cannot go out the door. So we say trust is important, but trust is beyond just what we do, it's how we think. So consumers are looking to all of us, it doesn't matter what company you're in, to stand up for your values. What are your values? And what does that mean? That means it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have their exact values. It means you have to be willing to talk about what your values are and then act against them. MasterCard, fortunately, has been very consistent in what we say our values are. We're about inclusivity. We're about making the world safe. And we do those things. There's other things that we're about. I'm pointing out two of them just to be clear. And these two things bring that trust factor to us. We have your back. Your card has services on it to have your back. We believe in sustainability. We believe in inclusivity. And if you look at what we've done, True Name Card, if you look at our touch card for those who are blind and they can now feel which card they're pulling out of their wallet and they don't have to worry or ask somebody that may or may not tell them the truth. So we are living our inclusivity speak. And we continue to do that. And that, to me, is why I want to work at MasterCard.
I think those actions are so important. But one thing I took away from this year's survey is also, it's not just the actions and the symbolic actions you do, but how do you transact day to day, right? We had a question around customer service. And I think 80+ % of people believe customer service is getting too automated. And what does that mean? That actually erodes trust, right? People know, wait, am I chatting with someone that's live that can actually help me with my problem? Or is this someone's going to say, thank you so much for joining us, did I solve your problem today, right? I think even things, the business as usual things, and I love the examples you provided, are symbolic of what you believe and how you act. And I think including that question about customer service was such an interesting choice by our teams, because it touches on technology, on trust, on values. I think is all really, really critical.
Yeah, and I think the fascinating thing is they're willing to talk to a bot.
Yeah.
They're okay with that as long as you tell them it's a bot.
That's right.
And they want an option. Okay, I don't want the bot, thank you very much. I want a live human being.
You're
Give me that option.
screaming agent into the phone, right?
I've never done that.
I do it all the time. It picks up and I'm like, agent, before they even answer anything, right?
Yeah, and sometimes you have to scream swear words. But I digress. But I think, it's gaining the trust. It's making sure that you live what you say and that your values are transparent. And I talk to our customers all the time about, you can't have values and know that you have them and not tell people you have them, because they don't read minds and they're not every day getting on your website. So you have to tell them what your values are in some way so that they know what they are and then they can follow you.
Yeah. And I think also too, it's the day-to-day, it's living your values, but it's also how do you recover from a mishap, a cultural event that you didn't handle properly. With Ipsos, when I was at Paramount, I worked on the industry in progress study with Ipsos. And what we learned is that consumers are actually very forgiving of brands. They're willing to give brands grace because they understand that these are monolithic corporations with lots of hands in the soup. So it's really making sure that you have a plan to go viral in a good way and in a bad way, and having a crisis management plan and making sure that it is aligned to your values.
Yep.
I think it's so great to be talking about values, because when you talk about trends, it's always about change, it's always about change, it's always about change. But it's funny how these conversations always come back to the idea of values, which are some things that don't change, right? And I think that's always the balance you're playing with. What are the things that makes us all human, right? And to your point earlier, I think in the end, sometimes the world is more similar than we are different. We like to call out the differences and the changes, but I think there's a lot that tie us.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have today. So thank you all so much for coming. This has been a really awesome conversation. And I mean, really just such a great report to go off of, and really just to jump off and talk about the foresight work that you all are doing every day. So thank you so much for coming.
Great. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend diving into the full report on IpsosGlobalTrends.com to learn so much more about global trends and what it means for the US and the world at large. We have one more chapter of our Global Trends Insights to Activate campaign coming. A client impact story, talking about how Haleon has used trends and foresight to rethink how they plan for the future of consumer healthcare. And join us next month for a dive into one of the hottest topics in the business world today, how behavior-changing drugs known as GLP-1s could reshape society beyond just weight loss, and how businesses across sectors need to prepare. Thanks again for watching. I'm Ben Meyerson, and this has been Insights to Activate with Ipsos.